The gunshot echoed across the Sangre de Cristo Valley like thunder trapped between the Red Canyon walls. Jack Morrison jerked awake from his chair on the porch, coffee spilling across his weathered hands as his eyes swept the horizon. In the distance, a horse galloped riderless toward his ranch, its reins trailing in the dust like broken promises. Something dark stained the saddle. But before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn sun hung low over the Arizona territory, painting the desert in shades of amber and rust. Jack Morrison had grown accustomed to the silence that wrapped around his ranch like a shroud. 3 years had passed since Rebecca's fever took her. 3 years since he'd traded his cavalry uniform for rancher's clothes and his commission for solitude. The Broken Creek Ranch sprawled across 500 acres of scrubland and dreams that had withered under the territorial sun. On this particular morning in October of 1881, Jack sat where he always sat when dawn broke over the valley on the wooden porch his own hands had built, drinking coffee strong enough to wake the dead. The ritual never changed. Rise before the sun, check the cattle, tend the horses, repair what the desert had broken overnight, and settle into the chair that faced the mountains where the Apache still roamed free. The territory buzzed with talk of statehood, of progress and civilization taming the wild frontier, but Jack Morrison wanted no part of it. He'd seen enough of civilization during his years in the cavalry, enough to know that progress often came with a price measured in blood and broken treaties. His ranch sat at the edge of everything, too far from Copper Ridge to be bothered by townspeople, too isolated for casual visitors, exactly the way he preferred it. His cattle moved lazily across the pasture, their bells creating a gentle symphony that mixed with the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods along Willow Creek. Rebecca had loved those trees. She'd planned to build a garden beneath their shade, to raise children who would climb their branches and carve their names in the bark. Instead, Jack tended them alone, watering them when the creek ran low, trimming dead branches that reminded him too much of dead dreams. San Torres, his only ranch hand and the closest thing to a friend he had left, emerged from the barn leading Jack's stallion, Ranger. The Mexican-American cowboy had drifted onto the ranch 2 years ago, a man running from his own ghosts, and Jack had hired him without asking questions. Some wounds were better left unprobed. "Morning, Center Jack," Sam called, his voice carrying the melody of his homeland. "Ranger's favoring his right front hoof again. Want me to check for stones?" Jack nodded, draining the last of his coffee. "Do that. And Sam, how many times do I have to tell you? Just Jack, the war's over." Sam grinned, the kind of smile that suggested he'd keep using the respectful title, regardless of Jack's protests. "See, just Jack, the cattle look good today, fat and happy." "Fat cattle make for happy bank accounts," Jack replied, though money had ceased to motivate him years ago. The ranch provided enough to live on, enough to maintain the illusion of purpose. Some men needed grand ambitions to drive them forward. Jack Morrison had learned to find meaning in the simple act of survival. The morning progressed with the predictable rhythm of ranch life. Jack rode fence lines, checking for breaks where cattle might wander into Apache territory and never return. The boundary between his land and the tribal lands wasn't marked by any fence the government would recognize, but every rancher in the valley knew exactly where it ran. Cross that invisible line without permission, and you might find yourself explaining your presence to warriors who had little patience for trespassers. Jack understood their anger. He'd been part of the machine that had driven them from there. Ancestral homes had followed orders that resulted in families torn apart and sacred places defiled. The knowledge sat in his stomach like a stone, one of many reasons he'd walked away from his military career. A man could only follow so many orders that contradicted his conscience before something inside him broke beyond repair. The old mine Shaft sat about 3 miles northeast of the ranch house, a reminder of previous owners who'd dreamed of striking silver in the desert. Jack rarely rode out that far. The mine had been abandoned for years, and the cattle avoided the area as if they sensed something unsettling about the place. But on this day, something drew him toward the rocky outcropping where the shaft's entrance yawned like a mouth frozen in a scream. Perhaps it was the vultures circling overhead, or the way his horse's ears pricked forward with interest rather than fear. Perhaps it was the cavalry training that had never quite left his bones, the instinct that whispered when something in the landscape didn't belong. Whatever the reason, Jack found himself guiding Ranger up the rocky slope, his hand unconsciously checking the Colt revolver at his hip. The gunshot that had awakened him that morning suddenly made sense. Near the mine's entrance, the ground showed signs of disturbance: scuffed earth, broken mesquite branches, drops of blood that hadn't yet been claimed by the desert sand. Someone had been here recently, someone who'd left in a hurry. Jack dismounted and approached the mine shaft with caution. The wooden supports looked ready to collapse at the slightest provocation, and the darkness beyond the entrance seemed to swallow light without giving anything back. But there, just inside the opening where the afternoon sun still reached, he saw her. She couldn't have been more than 19, with long black hair that spilled across the stone floor like spilled ink. Her clothing marked her as Apache traditional. Buckskin dress decorated with intricate beadwork, moccasins that had seen many miles of hard travel. But it was the blood seeping from her left shoulder and the way she clutched a cavalry saber that made Jack's breath catch in his throat. The saber bore the distinctive markings of the 4th Cavalry Regiment, his old unit. Someone had been hurt, possibly killed, and this young woman had claimed their weapon. The implication sent a chill down Jack's spine that had nothing to do with the mine's cold interior. She was unconscious, her breathing shallow but steady. Jack had seen enough battlefield wounds to recognize that the bullet had passed through cleanly, missing bone and major blood vessels. She would live, assuming infection didn't set in or she didn't lose too much blood while unconscious in a mine shaft. The smart thing would be to ride back to the ranch, saddle a fresh horse, and head straight to Copper Ridge to inform Captain Hayes that he'd found evidence of an Apache raid. The smart thing would be to let the territorial authorities handle whatever had happened here. The smart thing would be to remember that this young woman's people were still technically at war with his people, despite the unofficial truces that kept the violence from boiling over completely. Instead, Jack Morrison did the human thing. He holstered his weapon, removed his shirt, and carefully lifted the unconscious Apache woman into his arms. She was lighter than he'd expected, and younger than she'd appeared in the shadows. Her face, relaxed in unconsciousness, held an innocence that reminded him of Rebecca at that age. The ride back to the ranch tested every skill Jack had learned during his cavalry years. The woman he found himself thinking of her as Elena, though he had no idea what her actual name might be, remained unconscious but breathing throughout the journey. Sam met them at the ranch house, his eyes widening when he saw what Jack carried. "Dios mío," Sam whispered, crossing himself. "Senator Jack, do you know what you are doing?" "Probably not," Jack admitted, carrying Elena into the house. "But I know what I'm not doing. I'm not leaving someone to die in a mine shaft." They laid her on the bed in what had been Rebecca's sewing room, a space Jack had avoided for 3 years. Sam fetched water and clean cloth while Jack examined the wound more carefully. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The bullet had indeed passed through cleanly, entering just below her left shoulder and exiting near her shoulder blade. The bleeding had mostly stopped, which suggested she hadn't been unconscious for long. "We need Maria," Jack said, referring to the Mexican healer who lived on a small farm between his ranch and Copper Ridge. "She know how to treat this properly." And if Maria asks questions? Sam's voice carried the weight of a man who understood the dangerous game they were playing. We tell her the truth. We found someone hurt, and we're helping them. Jack met his friend's concerned gaze. Some things are more important than politics. Sam. While Sam rode to fetch Maria Santos, Jack found himself sitting beside the bed, studying the face of the woman who had literally fallen into his ordered, solitary world. She was beautiful in the way desert flowers were beautiful striking, and delicate and completely out of place in his rough rancher's life. Her hands, he noticed, were calloused from work, but also bore the intricate henna designs he'd seen on Apache women during his cavalry days. These weren't the hands of a typical settler woman, or even a typical Apache woman. These belonged to someone caught between worlds. The cavalry saber lay on the table beside the bed, cleaned of blood, but still bearing its mysterious story. Jack recognized the markings. It had belonged to Lieutenant William Crawford, a young officer who'd served under Jack's command. Crawford had been assigned to a patrol along the territorial border just last week. If this woman had his saber, it meant either Crawford was dead or something more complicated had occurred. Maria Santos arrived as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, her weathered face showing no surprise at finding an Apache woman in Jack Morrison's spare bedroom. Maria had seen too much of life to be shocked by much of anything, and her reputation as a healer extended into both Apache and Mexican communities, despite the territorial boundaries drawn by politicians in distant capitals. She has been shot, Maria observed, her English accented but precise. Recently, but not today. Yesterday, perhaps. Can you help her? Jack asked. Maria's dark eyes studied him with the intensity of someone reading a book written in a foreign language. I can help her heal from the bullet wound, yes. But Senator Morrison, do you understand what you have brought into your home? Someone who needed help, Jack replied. Someone whose father leads 200 warriors, Maria corrected gently. Someone whose disappearance will bring questions that bullets might answer faster than words. The weight of that information settled on Jack's shoulders like a mantle. Made of lead, 200 warriors. Chief Running Bear's daughter, if Maria's implied identification was correct. The most wanted Apache leader in the territory, a man whose very name could empty saloons and send settlers reaching for their weapons. What would you do, Maria? Jack asked. The healer smiled, the expression transforming her weathered features into something almost maternal. The same thing you are doing, I think. But I would do it with my eyes open and my prayers current. As Maria worked to properly clean and dress Elena's wound, Jack found himself pacing the small house like a caged wolf. Every sound from outside made him reach for his weapon. Every shadow that moved past the windows sent his pulse racing. He was harboring the daughter of the most feared Apache chief in the territory, in direct violation of federal law and common sense. Yet when Elena stirred as Maria finished her work, when her dark eyes opened and fixed on Jack's face with a mixture of fear and confusion, he felt something inside his chest that had been dormant for 3 years suddenly flutter back to life. Not attraction exactly, though she was undeniably beautiful. Something deeper and more dangerous, the recognition of another soul adrift in a world that didn't seem to have a place for them. Where? Elena's voice came out as barely more. Then a whisper, and she spoke in English rather than Apache. Where am I? My ranch, Jack replied, settling into the chair beside the bed with the careful movements of a man approaching a wild animal. You were hurt. We're trying to help. Elena's eyes darted around the room, taking in the simple furnishings, the woman's belongings that spoke of a previous occupant, the carefully tended space that felt more like a sanctuary than a sick room. You are the rancher Morrison. It wasn't a question, which surprised him. You know who I am? Your reputation precedes you among my people, Elena said, struggling to sit up despite Maria's gentle protests. The cavalry officer who walked Away from war. Jack hadn't expected that. In his mind, his departure from the military had been a quiet affair, unnoticed by anyone except his former commanding officers. The idea that Apache communities had discussed his decision, had perhaps even debated its meaning, struck him as both flattering and terrifying. "Why were you in the mine shaft?" he asked. Elena's expression shuddered like doors slamming shut. "That is not your concern. When someone shows up bleeding on my land with a cavalry saber, it becomes my concern," Jack replied, his voice remaining gentle despite the firmness of his words. "Especially when that someone is the daughter of Chief Running Bear." Elena's sharp intake of breath told him his guess had been correct. Maria nodded slightly, confirming what Jack had already begun to suspect. He was harboring not just any Apache woman, but the most politically valuable one in the territory. "My father," Elena began, then stopped, her hand moving unconsciously to the medicine bag that hung around her neck. "My father does not know where I am, but he'll come looking," Jack said. "Yes." The word carried the weight of absolute certainty. "He will come, and when he does, this place will be surrounded by more warriors than you have bullets." The sun had set completely now, casting the room in the warm glow of oil lamps. Outside, Jack could hear Sam settling the horses for the night, the familiar sounds of a ranch preparing for darkness. In a few hours, Elena would be strong enough to travel if she chose to leave. In a few hours, Jack Morrison could return to his ordered, solitary existence and pretend this evening had never happened. Instead, he looked at the young woman who had appeared in his life like a desert storm sudden, dangerous and impossible to ignore, and made a decision that would change everything. "Then we'd better make sure you're healed before he arrives," Jack said. "Maria, what do you need to keep her comfortable tonight?" As Maria listed the supplies Elena would need for a proper recovery, Jack found himself calculating not the risks of what he was doing, but the logistics. Food, medical supplies, security precautions, contingency plans for when Chief Running Bear's warriors inevitably appeared on his horizon. 3 years of carefully constructed isolation were about to end, and Jack Morrison discovered that the prospect didn't frighten him as much as it should have. Perhaps it was time to remember what it felt like to fight for something that mattered. Perhaps it was time to discover whether the man who'd walked away from war still had it in him to make a stand when standing was the right thing to do. Outside, coyotes began their nightly chorus among the red rocks and scattered dreams of the Sangre de Cristo Valley. Inside the ranch house, 3 people from 3 different worlds settled in for a night that would mark the beginning of everything that followed, the first chapter in a story that would test the boundaries between honor and survival, between justice and mercy, between the man Jack Morrison had been and the man he was about to become. Dawn arrived with the sound of horses approaching from the south, their hoofbeats drumming against the hardpan like a warning. Jack Morrison stepped onto his porch, rifle in hand, squinting through the morning haze at the dust cloud rising from the direction of Copper Ridge. 3 riders emerged from the shimmer, their uniforms identifying them as territorial cavalry before their faces became clear. Captain William Hayes rode in the center, his bearing as rigid as the day Jack had served under him 5 years earlier. Flanking him were 2 younger soldiers Jack didn't recognize, their hands resting casually on their sidearms in the way of men who expected trouble but hoped to avoid it. "Jack Morrison," Hayes called out as he reined his horse to a stop 20 feet from the porch. "Permission to dismount and water our horses?" "Granted," Jack replied, though he didn't lower his rifle. "What brings you out to my corner of nowhere, Captain?" Hayes swung down from his saddle with the careful movements of a man whose joints reminded him daily of too many years in the saddle. "Missing patrol. Jack, Lieutenant Crawford and 4 men went out 3 days ago to check reports of Apache movement near the old mining claims. They haven't reported back." The cavalry saber hidden in Elena's room seemed to burn against Jack's consciousness like a brand. Crawford's saber, stained with blood, lying beside an unconscious Apache woman who spoke English like someone educated. In mission schools, the pieces of a larger puzzle were beginning to arrange themselves in patterns Jack didn't like. "Haven't seen any patrols," Jack said, which was technically true. He hadn't seen Crawford's patrol, only the aftermath of whatever had happened to them. "Apache sign along the creek bed, about 5 miles east of here," one of the younger soldiers offered. "Fresh tracks, maybe 2 days old." Hayes nodded grimly. "We're checking all the ranches in the area, Jack. Anyone seen anything unusual? Heard gunshots, found evidence of raiding parties?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Jack could feel Elena's presence in the house behind him, could sense her listening to every word even though she was supposed to be resting. Sam Torres emerged from the barn, his expression carefully neutral as he nodded respectfully to the soldiers. "Quiet as a church out here, Captain," Sam said. "Nothing but cattle and coyotes." Hayes studied Sam's face with the intensity of a man trained to read lies in the expressions of others. "You're Torres, right? Word in town is you used to ride with some rough crowds down in Sonora." "Used to," Sam agreed. "Now I punch cattle and fix fences. Much less exciting." "Less exciting can be good for a man's health," Hayes observed. He turned back to Jack, his pale eyes holding questions. Jack wasn't ready to answer. "You mind if we search the premises?" "Just being thorough." Every muscle in Jack's body tensed. Elena was hidden in Rebecca's old sewing room, barely strong enough to stand, let alone flee if soldiers started kicking down doors. The cavalry saber lay wrapped in an old blanket beneath the bed, evidence of whatever had happened to Crawford's patrol. "Search for what, exactly?" Jack asked. "Signs of Apache presence. Stolen military equipment. Evidence of what happened to 5 missing soldiers." Hayes stepped closer, his voice dropping to the tone he'd used during their cavalry days when discussing classified missions. "Jack, I know you left the service under difficult circumstances. I know you have philosophical differences with current Apache policy. But if you're harboring enemies of the territory, I need to know." The word enemies hit Jack like a physical blow. Elena wasn't his enemy. She was a wounded young woman who'd somehow become tangled up in whatever had happened to Crawford's patrol. But explaining that to Hayes would require explanations Jack wasn't prepared to give. "You're welcome to look around," Jack said finally. "But there's nothing here except ranch equipment and bad coffee." Hayes gestured to his men, who began walking toward the barn and outbuildings. Jack watched them go, calculating distances and escape routes with the tactical mind that had kept him alive during too many Apache campaigns. If they found evidence of Elena's presence, if they insisted on searching the house thoroughly, everything would unravel faster than a rope in a prairie fire. "You look tired, Jack," Hayes observed, his attention returning to his former subordinate. "Sleeping poorly?" "Ranch work starts early," Jack replied. "I remember." "I also remember that you were never much of a liar." Hayes tilted his head slightly, studying Jack's face with professional interest. "Whatever happened to Crawford's patrol, it happened close to here. Apache War Party doesn't just vanish into thin air, especially not after engaging federal troops." "Maybe they went home," Jack suggested. Jack asked, settling into the chair beside the bed. Elena's hand moved unconsciously to her wounded shoulder. "I knew him. He was different from the other cavalry officers. He treated Apache prisoners with respect, never participated in the raids on our villages." "What happened to him, Elena?" For a long moment, she didn't answer. Her dark eyes stared past Jack toward the window, where afternoon light filtered through Rebecca's old curtains. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone confessing sins that weren't entirely her own. 3 days ago, my father received word that a cavalry patrol was moving through the sacred canyon near Eagle's Nest Mountain. The soldiers were not supposed to be there, That area was protected by the old treaties. But treaties mean little when there is gold in the ground. Jack felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach. Gold had a way of rendering treaties meaningless, of turning peaceful neighbors into enemies overnight. My father sent warriors to escort the soldiers away from the sacred places, Elena continued. Not to fight, just to guide them back to the agreed boundaries. But when the warriors approached under a flag of truce, the soldiers opened fire. Crawford ordered them to fire on a truce party? Jack asked, though he already suspected the answer would be more complicated than that. Lieutenant Crawford was not in command that day. Sergeant Murphy had assumed leadership of the patrol when Crawford fell ill with fever. Murphy believed that the only good Apache was a dead Apache. Jack closed his eyes, picturing the scenario. Young sergeant in temporary command. Nervous soldiers in unfamiliar territory. Apache warriors approaching under circumstances that could be interpreted as either peaceful or threatening. A recipe for disaster that had played out across the frontier more times than anyone wanted to count. What happened next? He asked. The warriors fought back. They had no choice. Murphy's men were shooting to kill. But when the fighting ended, Lieutenant Crawford was still alive. He had been wounded trying to stop his own men from firing on the truce party. And the others? Elena's expression hardened. Sergeant Murphy and 2 privates died in the fighting. The 4th soldier, a young man named Baker, surrendered when he saw Crawford trying to protect him from the warriors' anger. Where are Crawford and Baker now? Crawford is being cared for by our healers. His wound is serious, but not fatal. Elena paused, choosing her words carefully. Baker is being held until my father decides what to do with him. Some of the warriors want revenge for the broken truce. Others believe Crawford's intervention proves that not all white soldiers are our enemies. Jack was beginning to understand. The complexity of the situation. Elena had fled. Chief Running Bear faced a political crisis within his own tribe. How to respond to an attack by federal troops that had been prevented from becoming a massacre only by the intervention of one of those same troops. Why did you leave? Jack asked. Elena's shoulders sagged slightly, and for the first time since regaining consciousness, she looked her age. Because my father's advisors believe the only way to prevent retaliation from the cavalry is to arrange a marriage alliance with Thunderhawk's band. Thunderhawk has been raiding settlements for months, building a reputation as a war leader. An alliance with him would give my father the warriors he needs to defend our people. But you don't want to marry Thunderhawk. I don't want to. Marry a man whose idea of honor involves killing innocent settlers, Elena replied firmly. I don't want to be the reason 2 Apache bands unite for war instead of peace. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place now. Elena hadn't just fled an arranged marriage. She'd fled a political alliance that could have turned the entire Apache nation toward open war with the territory. Her disappearance had probably thrown her father's negotiations with Thunderhawk into chaos, leaving Chief Running Bear with limited options for protecting his people. Crawford's saber, Jack said. How did you get it? He gave it to me when I left the healing lodge, Elena replied. He said it was proof that some cavalry officers still remembered their honor. He asked me to carry it to someone who would understand its meaning. Someone like me. Someone like you, Elena agreed. He knew your reputation, knew you had walked away from war when war became dishonorable, he thought. He hoped you might be willing to help prevent a larger conflict. Jack stared at the young woman whose arrival had turned his carefully ordered world upside down. She wasn't just Chief Running Bear's daughter fleeing an unwanted marriage. She was a peace offering, a bridge between 2 worlds that seemed determined to destroy each other. What did Crawford want me to do? Jack asked. He wanted you to carry a message to Captain Hayes, a message that would explain what really happened in the Sacred Canyon, that would prevent the cavalry from launching a punitive expedition against my father's people. Maybe they got what they came for and decided not to push their luck. Or maybe they left someone behind, Hayes countered. Someone who needed time to heal before traveling. Someone important enough to risk exposure by staying in the area. The conversation was heading toward dangerous territory faster than Jack had anticipated. Hayes had always been smart, always able to read situations and people with the skill that had made him an effective cavalry officer. Now that intelligence was focused on Jack like a magnifying glass concentrating sunlight. One of the younger soldiers returned from the barn, shaking his head. "Nothing unusual, sir. Just ranch equipment and about a dozen horses." "Check the house," Hayes ordered. Jack's blood turned to ice water. "The house isn't necessary, Captain. I told you there's nothing here." "Then you won't mind if we verify that," Hayes replied, his tone becoming more formal. "Standard procedure in cases involving missing military personnel." The front door opened before Jack could respond, and Maria Santos stepped onto the porch, carrying a basket of herbs and medical supplies. Her timing was either miraculous or carefully planned, and Jack found himself grateful for her presence, regardless of which it was. "Buenos dias, Captain Hayes," Maria said, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone accustomed to dealing with men in uniform. "You are looking for the missing soldiers, yes?" "That's right, Maria. Have you seen anything unusual in the past few days?" Maria shook her head slowly. "Only the usual ranch sickness. Senator Morrison asked me to check his cattle for the spotted fever. Some of the cows have been acting strangely." Hayes frowned. "Spotted fever? Is that contagious to humans?" "Very contagious," Maria replied gravely. "I have been treating the sick animals in the back room of the house. It is not safe for visitors until the fever passes." Jack struggled to keep his expression neutral. Maria was providing him with a cover story for Elena's presence, explaining away any evidence the soldiers might find of someone recovering in the house. But she was also taking an enormous risk by lying to federal officers. "How long before?" "It's safe?" Hayes asked. "Perhaps a week," Maria replied. "Maybe longer. The fever must run its course completely before the danger passes." Hayes looked from Maria to Jack, clearly weighing the risks of exposure to cattle fever against the necessity of searching for evidence of Apache presence. After a long moment, he nodded reluctantly. "We'll check the outbuildings and the immediate area," he decided. "But if you're hiding anything, Jack, if you're playing games with federal authority, I'll find out eventually." "I'm not playing games," Jack replied, which was true even if it wasn't the complete truth. The soldiers spent another hour examining the ranch, checking the barn, the corral, the tool shed, and the area around the house. They found nothing more suspicious than ranch equipment and the normal detritus of frontier life. Hayes questioned Sam Torres more thoroughly, but Sam's answers remained consistent and unhelpful. As the soldiers prepared to leave, Hayes pulled Jack aside for a private conversation near the well. "Jack, I'm going to say something to you as a friend, not as a federal officer," Hayes began. "There are rumors coming down from territorial headquarters. Talk about settlers who've gotten too comfortable with Apache neighbors, who might be providing aid and comfort to hostile tribes." "What kind of rumors?" Jack asked. "The kind that could lead to federal investigations. The kind that could result in charges of treason against the territory." Hayes met Jack's eyes directly. "The kind that could get a man hanged if he's not careful about his associations." The warning was clear enough. Hayes suspected something, but he wasn't ready to act on his suspicions yet. He was giving Jack a chance to reconsider whatever path he was walking, to step back from the edge before it was too late. "I appreciate the warning," Jack said. "I hope you do more than appreciate it," Hayes replied. "I hope you take it seriously." The soldiers mounted their horses and rode away toward the north, leaving dust and unanswered questions in their wake. Jack watched them disappear into the shimmering heat before turning back to the house where Maria waited on the porch. That was quick thinking, Jack said. That was necessary thinking, Maria corrected. But it will not work forever. Captain Hayes is not a fool, and he will return with more soldiers if his suspicions grow stronger. How is she? Jack asked. Stronger than yesterday, not as strong as tomorrow, Maria replied in the cryptic way of healers everywhere. The wound is healing cleanly, but she has other injuries that will take longer to mend. Other injuries? Maria's expression grew. Troubled. Injuries to the spirit, Senator Morrison. This one has seen things that will follow her in dreams for many years to come. Jack found Alina sitting up in bed when he entered the sewing room, her back propped against pillows Sam had arranged for her comfort. She wore one of Rebecca's old dresses, altered to fit her smaller frame, and her long black hair had been braided back from her face. The transformation was startling. She looked less like a wounded Apache warrior and more like a young woman who might have been visiting from town. I heard the soldiers, Alina said without preamble. They were asking about Lieutenant Crawford. Did you know Crawford? And what message is that? Alina reached into the medicine bag around her neck and withdrew a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and handling. Crawford wrote down exactly what happened, including Sergeant Murphy's decision to fire on the truce party. He documented everything in his official report before the warriors took him to the healing lodge. Jack unfolded the paper and read Crawford's careful handwriting by the light from the window. The report was detailed and damning, describing Murphy's paranoia and aggression, his refusal to honor the Apache truce party, his decision to open fire on warriors who had approached under a flag of peace. This could prevent a war, Jack said slowly. Or it could start one, Alina replied. Captain Hayes will have to choose between accepting the word of a wounded lieutenant and the political pressure to avenge 4 dead soldiers. If he chooses politics over truth, then your father's people prepare for the worst, Jack finished. Alina nodded. And 200 warriors will ride south to protect the sacred places and avenge the broken truce. They will not stop with military targets, Senator Morrison. When Apache warriors ride to war, everyone in their path becomes an enemy. The weight of the decision settled on Jack's shoulders like a physical burden. He could deliver Crawford's report to Hayes, trusting that his former commanding officer would choose justice over political expedience. Or he could destroy the report and pretend this conversation had never happened, leaving Alina's people to face whatever consequences followed from the broken truce. But there was a third option, one that Crawford had perhaps anticipated when he'd given Alina the saber and the report. Jack could become more than just a messenger. He could become an advocate, using his military reputation and his understanding of both cultures to broker a peace that served everyone's interests. Alina, Jack said quietly, how long before your father's warriors come looking for you? Soon, she replied. My father is not a patient man when his daughter's safety is in question. And Thunderhawk. She paused, her expression darkening. Thunderhawk will see my disappearance as an insult to his honor. He will demand satisfaction, either through marriage or through blood. Then we don't have much time, Jack said, standing and walking to the window. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere out there, Chief Running Bear was gathering his warriors. Somewhere else, Captain Hayes was filing reports that could bring federal troops down on every Apache settlement in the territory. And here, in a ranch house that had been built for peace and quiet, Jack Morrison was being asked to choose between the safety of his carefully constructed solitude and the possibility of preventing a war that would consume everything he'd tried to build in the desert. There might be another way, Jack said, turning back to Alina. But it would require trust from both sides, and trust is something that's been in short supply around here lately. What are you thinking? Alina asked. Jack sat back down, his mind racing through possibilities and consequences. What if we arranged a meeting? Your father, Captain Hayes, myself as a neutral mediator. Crawford's report as evidence, your testimony as a witness to what really happened. My father would never agree to meet with cavalry officers on their terms, Elena said immediately. And Captain Hayes would never agree to meet with Apache leaders on equal terms. Then we meet on neutral ground, Jack replied. Here, on my ranch. Both sides can bring representatives, but no large forces. A peace conference instead of a war council. Elena studied his face intently. You would risk everything for people you barely know? I'd risk everything to prevent a war. That doesn't need to happen, Jack corrected. And to protect someone who trusted me enough to accept my help when she needed it most. For the first time since awakening in his house, Elena smiled. It was a small expression, barely more than a softening around her eyes, but it transformed her face completely. Crawford was right about you. You do remember what honor means. I remember what it costs, Jack replied grimly. The question is whether I'm still willing to pay that price. Outside, the wind began to pick up, carrying the scent of distant rain and the promise of change. Inside the ranch house, two people from different worlds began planning for a confrontation that would determine not just their own futures, but the future of everyone who called the Sangre de Cristo Valley home. The game had changed. Jack Morrison was no longer just sheltering a wounded Apache woman. He was positioning himself at the center of a conflict that could either bring peace to the territory or plunge it into the bloodiest war it had ever seen. And somewhere in the distance, 200 Apache warriors were sharpening their weapons and preparing to ride. The morning of the fourth day brought visitors Jack hadn't expected and Elena had been dreading. Sam Torres burst through the kitchen door while Jack was preparing coffee, his face flushed with exertion and worry. Riders coming from the north, Sam announced breathlessly. Maybe a dozen, moving fast. They ain't cavalry. Jack set down the coffee pot and reached for his rifle, but Elena's voice from the doorway stopped him cold. Do not reach for weapons, she said quietly. If these are my father's scouts, any sign of hostility will be seen as a declaration of war. She had dressed in her traditional Apache clothing again, the buckskin dress and intricate beadwork that marked her clearly as chief. Running Bear's daughter. Her shoulder was still tender, but she carried herself with the dignity of someone born to leadership. The transformation from wounded refugee to Apache royalty was complete and startling. Jack moved to the window and peered through the curtains. The riders approached in a formation he recognized from his cavalry day scouts in front, main body following at a distance, flankers protecting the group's sides. These weren't raiders or war party scouts. This was a formal delegation, and they were taking no chances with their safety. How many more are out there that we can't see? Jack asked. Probably 50, Elena replied matter-of-factly. My father never travels with fewer warriors than necessary to ensure his safe return home. The lead rider carried a long lance decorated with eagle feathers and strips of red cloth, a peace symbol Jack remembered from his military days. But the warriors following him were armed for war, their faces painted with the stark designs that usually preceded battle. The message was clear. They came in peace but were prepared for any eventuality. The delegation stopped 50 yards from the ranch house, their horses stamping and snorting in the morning stillness. The lead warrior, a man whose scarred face spoke of countless battles, raised his lance and called out in Apache. Elena answered from the doorway, her voice carrying the authority of her birthright. What did he say? Jack asked quietly. He said they've come to take the chief's daughter home, Elena replied. I told him I would speak with their leader. A second warrior rode forward, and Jack felt his breath catch in his throat. This man was younger than the first, perhaps 25, with the kind of lean, dangerous look that came from a lifetime of warfare. His horse was painted with symbols that marked him as a war chief, and the scalps hanging from his belt left no doubt. About his reputation. Thunderhawk, Elena whispered, and Jack heard fear in her voice for the first time since she'd awakened in his house. Thunderhawk dismounted with fluid grace and walked toward the porch, his hand resting casually on the tomahawk at his belt. When he spoke, his English was accented but precise, the words of a man who had learned the enemy's language to better understand their weaknesses. "Elena Redfeather," Thunderhawk said, his voice carrying across the distance between them like a challenge. "You have caused much trouble with your foolish flight." "I caused no trouble," Elena replied, stepping fully onto the porch. "I prevented a war that would have served no one except your ambition." Thunderhawk's eyes flicked to Jack, assessing him with the cold calculation of a predator measuring potential prey. "And this is the white man who dares to harbor the daughter of Chief Running Bear? The former cavalry officer who thinks Apache women are prizes to be claimed?" Jack stepped forward, keeping his hands visible and away from his weapons. "I'm the man who found someone hurt and offered help. Nothing more complicated than that." "Nothing is simple when it involves the daughter of Running Bear," Thunderhawk replied. "Especially when that daughter was promised to me in marriage 3 moons ago." The tension crackled between the two men like electricity before a thunderstorm. Jack could see Sam Torres positioning himself near the barn, ready to provide covering fire if the situation deteriorated. He could sense Elena's internal struggle as she faced the man her father had chosen for her, the alliance that would have cemented her people's survival. "Where is Chief Running Bear?" Jack asked. "I was told he would come for his daughter personally." Thunderhawk smiled, the expression holding no warmth whatsoever. "My war chief is dealing with more pressing matters. The cavalry has been asking questions about missing soldiers, questions that require careful answers." The implication was clear. Chief Running Bear was managing the political crisis created by Crawford's missing patrol, while Thunderhawk had been dispatched to collect Elena and resolve the marriage alliance. It was a practical division of responsibilities that also demonstrated Thunderhawk's growing influence within the tribe. "Elena has information about those missing soldiers," Jack said carefully. "Information that could prevent misunderstandings between your people and the territorial government." "The only misunderstanding," Thunderhawk replied, "is the white man's belief that Apache warriors care about their opinions." He turned his attention back to Elena. "Gather your belongings. We return to the village today. I will not marry you," Elena said simply. The words fell between them like stones into still water, creating ripples that spread outward to encompass everyone present. Thunderhawk's warriors shifted restlessly on their horses, hands moving toward weapons as they sensed their leader's anger building. "You will do what is best for your people," Thunderhawk said, his voice becoming dangerously quiet. "As will I. What is best for my people is peace with the white settlers," Elena replied. "Not a war that will bring federal troops down on every Apache village in the territory." Thunderhawk laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "Peace? The white man's peace is a lie told to make us weak while they steal our land. Your father understands this, even if his daughter has been corrupted by mission school teachings." Jack realized the conversation was heading toward violence faster than he could control. Thunderhawk hadn't come to negotiate or discuss alternatives. He'd come to collect what he considered his property and eliminate any obstacles to that goal. "There might be another way," Jack interjected. "A way that serves everyone's interests without bloodshed." Thunderhawk's cold gaze fixed on him again. "Speak quickly, white man. My patience grows thin." Jack took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would either diffuse the situation or ignite a battle that would leave most of them dead. "What if Elena's value to your people isn't as a wife, but as a diplomat? What if she could negotiate a peace treaty that protected Apache lands while preventing federal retaliation?" "Treaties are worthless," Thunderhawk spat. "The white man breaks every promise they make." "Some do," Jack agreed. "But not all." There are men in the territorial government who understand that war serves no one's interests. Men who would honor agreements that protected both Apache and settler communities. Elena stepped forward, sensing an opportunity to influence the conversation. Thunderhawk, you know I speak the white man's language better than most of our people. You know I understand their customs and their laws. I could be more valuable to you as an advocate than as a wife. For a moment, Thunderhawk seemed to consider her words. Then his expression hardened again, and Jack realized they had misread his motivations entirely. You speak of treaties and diplomacy, Thunderhawk said. But I speak of honor. The daughter of Running Bear was promised to me in marriage. To break that promise would shame both our families and weaken the alliance between our bands. And if Elena dies trying to escape that marriage? Jack asked. What happens to your honor then? The question hit its mark. Thunderhawk's eyes narrowed as he studied Jack's face, looking for the meaning behind the words. Are you threatening the daughter of Running Bear? Thunderhawk asked softly. I'm pointing out the reality of the situation, Jack replied. Elena would rather die than be forced into a marriage she doesn't want. If you take her back to your village against her will, you'll be carrying home a corpse, not a bride. Elena's sharp intake of breath told Jack he was walking a dangerous line, but he pressed forward anyway. On the other hand, if you release her from the marriage obligation, she could use her freedom to negotiate advantages for your people that no military alliance could provide. Such as? Thunderhawk demanded. Jack glanced at Elena, who nodded slightly. Safe passage for Apache traders through territorial settlements. Recognition of sacred sites that would be protected from mining claims. Formal agreements that would prevent cavalry patrols from entering traditional hunting grounds. These were ambitious goals, far beyond what any territorial government had been willing to consider in the past. But they represented the kind of practical benefits that could improve Apache life without requiring war. Thunderhawk was silent for a long moment, his gaze moving from Jack to Elena and back again. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested he was making a decision that would affect far more than just the three people standing on the ranch house porch. You would stake your life on these promises? Thunderhawk asked Jack. I would stake my life on the attempt to keep them, Jack replied carefully. And you? Thunderhawk turned to Elena. You would give up your father's protection, your place in the tribe, to pursue this fantasy of peace between our peoples? Elena lifted her chin defiantly. I would give up anything necessary to prevent a war that would destroy both our peoples. Thunderhawk walked closer to the porch, close enough that Jack could see the old knife scars on his hands, the careful way he carried himself that spoke of recent wounds not yet fully healed. This was a man who had been fighting his entire adult life, who knew the cost of war in ways that politicians and diplomats never could. There is wisdom in what you say, Thunderhawk admitted reluctantly. But there is also danger. If Elena fails in these negotiations, if the white man betrays her trust as they have betrayed ours so many times before, the consequences will fall on all our heads. And if we don't try, Elena said, the consequences will be the same, except they'll be written in blood instead of ink. The stalemate stretched between them like a rope under tension. Thunderhawk's warriors were growing restless, their horses sensing their riders' eagerness for action. Sam Torres remained motionless. Near the barn, his rifle ready but not yet raised. The morning sun climbed higher, turning the desert air shimmery with heat. Finally, Thunderhawk stepped back and raised his hand in a gesture Jack recognized as a formal acknowledgement. I will carry your words to Chief Running Bear, Thunderhawk announced. He will decide whether his daughter's plan has merit or whether she has been blinded by white man's promises. How long before he decides? Elena asked. 3 days, Thunderhawk replied. If Chief Running Bear agrees to your proposal, he will send word. If not, he shrugged eloquently. If not, I will return with enough warriors to ensure that you come home willingly or otherwise. The implicit threat was clear, but Jack also heard something else in Thunderhawk's words, a grudging respect for Elena's courage, and perhaps even a recognition that her diplomatic approach might succeed where military solutions had failed. As Thunderhawk prepared to mount his horse, he turned back to Jack one final time. "Former cavalry officer," Thunderhawk said, "you have chosen to involve yourself in Apache affairs. That choice cannot be undone. Elena's fate is now tied to yours and yours to hers. Consider carefully whether you are prepared for that responsibility." "I've considered it," Jack replied. Thunderhawk nodded once, then swung onto his horse with fluid grace. Within minutes, the delegation was riding north toward the mountains, leaving dust and unanswered questions in their wake. Elena sagged against the porch railing as soon as the Apache warriors were out of sight, the effort of maintaining her composure finally taking its toll. Jack moved to support her, feeling the tremor in her shoulders that spoke of exhaustion and relief. "That went better than I expected," she said weakly. "Better how?" Jack asked. "Thunderhawk just gave us 3 days to accomplish something that territorial governments have been failing to do for decades. He gave us 3 days instead of taking me back immediately," Elena corrected. "In Apache culture, that represents enormous respect for your words and my determination." Sam Torres approached from the barn, his rifle still in his hands but no longer at the ready. "Senator Jack, what happens in 3 days if Chief Running Bear says no?" Jack looked toward the mountains where Thunderhawk's delegation had disappeared, then back at Elena's determined face. "Then we find out whether I remember enough about military tactics to defend this ranch against 50 Apache warriors." "You cannot fight my father's people," Elena said firmly. "Even if you could win, which you cannot, it would destroy any chance of peace between Apache and white settlers." "Then we'd better make sure your diplomatic solution works," Jack replied grimly. The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation and planning. Elena, despite her wound, threw herself into composing letters to territorial officials she'd met during her time at the mission school. Jack wrote to Captain Hayes, requesting a meeting to discuss new information regarding the missing patrol. Sam Torres rode to Copper Ridge to purchase supplies and gather intelligence about cavalry movements in the area. The responses began arriving on the second day. Captain Hayes agreed to meet, though his letter carried undertones of suspicion about Jack's sudden interest in official business. 2 territorial judges expressed willingness to discuss Apache relations, provided adequate security could be guaranteed for any such meeting. Most surprisingly, a letter arrived from Lieutenant Crawford himself, carried by an Apache messenger who appeared at the ranch like a ghost and disappeared just as silently. Crawford's message was brief but encouraging. He supported Elena's diplomatic initiative and was prepared to testify about the true events surrounding his patrol's encounter with Apache warriors. By the evening of the second day, the framework of a plan was taking shape. Elena would meet with territorial officials under Jack's protection, presenting Crawford's testimony and her own proposals for peaceful coexistence. If the officials showed genuine interest, a formal conference could be arranged with Chief Running Bear's participation. It was ambitious, dangerous, and probably doomed to failure. But it was also the only alternative to a war that would consume everything Jack had built in the desert and everything Elena's people had managed to preserve of their traditional way of life. On the morning of the third day, Jack awoke to find Elena already dressed and preparing coffee in the kitchen. She moved carefully, favoring her wounded shoulder, but her face showed determination rather than pain. "Today your father decides," Jack observed. "Today my father chooses between the wisdom of his daughter and the ambition of his war chiefs," Elena corrected. "The decision was never really about me. It was about whether the Apache Nation would choose war or peace as their path forward." Jack poured himself coffee and joined her at the kitchen table. "And what do you think he'll choose?" Elena was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window toward the mountains where her father's village lay hidden among the ancient rocks and sacred places. "My father is old enough to remember when Apache warriors could ride from Mexico to Colorado without seeing a single white settlement," she said finally. "He has watched our world grow smaller every year, watched our people forced onto reservations or into hiding in the mountains. He knows that military resistance alone cannot preserve what remains of our way of life." "But Thunderhawk represents the younger generation," Jack observed. "The warriors who've never known anything except conflict with white settlers." "Yes, and they have legitimate grievances. They've seen too many treaties broken, too many promises betrayed. They believe the only language white men understand is violence." Jack nodded grimly. "They're not entirely wrong." "No," Elena agreed, "they're not. But they're not entirely right either. There are white men like you, like Lieutenant Crawford, who understand that honor transcends the color of a man's skin. There are territorial officials who recognize that peace serves everyone's interests better than war." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. Jack moved to the window and saw a single rider approaching from the north, moving at a steady pace that suggested neither urgent news nor hostile intent. "One of my father's messengers," Elena said, reading something in the rider's posture that Jack couldn't decipher. The messenger was a young Apache woman, perhaps Elena's age, dressed in the practical clothing of someone who had ridden hard and fast. She dismounted gracefully and approached the porch with the confidence of someone carrying important news. She spoke rapidly in Apache, her words tumbling over each other in her eagerness to deliver her message. Elena listened intently, her expression growing more hopeful with each sentence. "What did she say?" Jack asked when the conversation ended. Elena turned to him with the first genuine smile he'd seen since she'd awakened in his house. "My father has agreed to the diplomatic meeting," she announced, "but there are conditions." "Such as?" "The meeting must take place on neutral ground here. At your ranch. Both sides may bring advisors, but no large military forces. And if the negotiations fail, you have guaranteed safe passage for all Apache participants back to their territory." Jack felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. "A guaranteed safe passage? My father assumes that any man willing to risk his life to help his daughter would be willing to risk his life to honor his word," Elena explained. Was he wrong in that assumption? Jack looked at the young Apache woman who had turned his carefully ordered world upside down, at Sam Torres who had chosen loyalty over safety, at the ranch that had become something far more significant than a place to raise cattle. "No," he said finally, "he wasn't wrong." The messenger remounted her horse and rode away, carrying Jack's acceptance back to Chief Running Bear. In 3 days, the most important Apache leader in the territory would arrive at Broken Creek Ranch for a meeting that would either establish a new foundation for peace or provide the final provocation for all-out war. Jack Morrison, former cavalry officer turned reluctant diplomat, had 72 hours to arrange a miracle. The federal delegation arrived at dawn on the appointed day, their approach announced by the drumming of hooves across the hardpan and the glint of morning sun on polished brass buttons. Captain Hayes led the procession, flanked by 2 territorial judges and a Colonel Jack didn't recognize. Behind them rode a carefully selected escort of soldiers, enough to ensure their safety, but not so many as to appear threatening to the Apache delegation that would arrive from the opposite direction. Jack stood on his porch watching the approaching riders, feeling the weight of history settling on his shoulders like a mantle passed down through generations. In his pocket, he carried Crawford's written testimony and Elena's carefully crafted proposals. In his heart, he carried the hope that words might prove stronger than weapons in determining the future of the Sangre de Cristo Valley. Alina emerged from the house wearing a dress that somehow managed to honor both her Apache heritage and the formal expectations of territorial officials. Her shoulder had healed enough to allow full movement, and her bearing reflected the confidence of someone born to navigate between worlds. She had spent the previous evening practicing her presentation, refining arguments that could persuade men who had built their careers on the assumption that Apache and white interests were fundamentally incompatible. "They look nervous," Alina observed, watching the federal delegation's cautious approach. "They should be nervous," Jack replied. "They're about to meet with the most feared Apache leader in the territory while standing on land that's too far from military support to matter if things go wrong." Captain Hayes dismounted first, his weathered face showing the strain of a man who had spent 3 sleepless nights considering all the ways this meeting could end in disaster. He approached the porch with the measured steps of someone walking toward either triumph or catastrophe. "Jack," Hayes said formally, "I hope you understand what you've asked of us here today. I understand I've asked you to choose between honor and expediency," Jack replied. "I hope you understand which choice serves the territory's long-term interests." The territorial judges introduced themselves with the cautious courtesy of men venturing into unmapped political territory. Judge Harrison was a thin, scholarly man whose reputation for fairness had earned respect even among Apache leaders who had appeared in his court. Judge Martinez brought the perspective of someone whose own family had navigated the complex relationships between Mexican, Apache, and Anglo communities for generations. Colonel Benjamin Garrett represented the military's interests, and his presence signaled that any agreements reached today would need to satisfy the Army's concerns about territorial security. Garrett was younger than Jack had expected, probably a West Point graduate whose career had been built on frontier service rather than Eastern political connections. "Where exactly are we meeting?" Judge Harrison asked, surveying the ranch buildings with professional interest. "The barn," Jack replied. "Neutral ground, large enough for both delegations, and defensible if negotiations break down into something more violent." "You expect violence?" Colonel Garrett asked sharply. "I expect passionate disagreements between people who have been killing each other for decades," Jack replied honestly. "Whether those disagreements become violent depends on how well we manage the next few hours." The sound of horses approaching from the north drew everyone's attention to the horizon, where dust clouds marked the Apache delegation's arrival. Chief Running Bear rode at the center of the formation, his presence unmistakable even at a distance. The war chief carried himself with the dignity of someone who had never bowed to any authority except his own conscience and the welfare of his people. Elena's sharp intake of breath reminded Jack that she was seeing her father for the first time since fleeing the arranged marriage that would have allied her band with Thunderhawk's warriors. Whatever conversations had taken place in the Apache village during the past few days, they had concluded with Running Bear's decision to risk everything on his daughter's diplomatic vision. The Apache delegation numbered exactly 12 riders, a careful balance between showing respect for the occasion and avoiding any appearance of military threat. Thunderhawk rode at Running Bear's right hand, his presence a reminder that the war faction remained influential even if they had agreed to attempt peaceful resolution first. Chief Running Bear was smaller than Jack had expected, but his presence filled the landscape like a force of nature barely contained in human form. His hair showed threads of silver, and his face bore the deep lines that came from decades of making decisions that affected hundreds of lives. When he dismounted, his movements carried the careful precision of someone whose body had absorbed countless wounds in service of his people's survival. The two delegations faced each other across the ranch yard like armies pausing before battle. Federal officials studied Apache warriors with the wary assessment of men who had read too many reports about frontier violence. Apache leaders evaluated territorial representatives with the cold calculation of people who had learned to expect betrayal from every negotiation. Jack stepped forward into the space between the groups, feeling like a man walking between lightning and thunder. "Chief." "Running Bear," Jack said in the few words of Apache he remembered from his cavalry days. "You honor my land with your presence." Running Bear's response came in English, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard across great distances. "Jack Morrison, your words brought me here. Let us see if your promises carry the same weight." The formal introductions followed diplomatic protocol established through decades of treaty negotiations, each participant identifying themselves and their authority to speak for their people. When Colonel Garrett mentioned his West Point education, Thunder Hawk responded by listing the cavalry officers he had killed in single combat, creating a moment of tension that required all of Jack's diplomatic skills to diffuse. They moved into the barn, where San Torres had arranged chairs in a circle that avoided giving any party the appearance of superior position. The setting was informal enough to encourage honest conversation, while remaining structured enough to prevent chaos. Elena stood as the delegation settled into their seats, her voice carrying clearly in the barn's acoustic space. "My name is Elena Redfeather, daughter of Chief Running Bear, educated at San Carlos Mission, and witness to the events that have brought us together," she began. "I speak for the possibility that Apache and white peoples can share this land without destroying each other in the process." She began with Crawford's testimony, reading the lieutenant's careful documentation of Sergeant Murphy's decision to fire on the Apache truce party. The federal officials listened with growing discomfort as the report detailed the breakdown of military discipline that had transformed a peaceful encounter into a deadly confrontation. Lieutenant Crawford risked his life trying to prevent his own men from committing what he recognized as murder, Elena continued. He protected Private Baker from Apache anger, and he has spent the past weeks being cared for by Apache healers rather than federal doctors. Judge Martinez leaned forward, his interest obviously genuine. "Where is Lieutenant Crawford now?" "Safe in my father's village," Running Bear answered. "Being healed by medicine men who understand wounds of both body and spirit." Colonel Garrett's expression showed skepticism that bordered on disbelief. "You're holding a federal officer against his will?" "I am protecting a federal officer from the consequences of his honor," Running Bear corrected firmly. "When he is fully healed, he will return to his duties with stories about Apache hospitality rather than Apache brutality." The distinction was subtle but crucial, reframing Crawford's situation from captivity to sanctuary. Elena used the moment to transition into her larger argument about the benefits of cooperation over conflict. For every story like Sergeant Murphy's, there could be stories like Lieutenant Crawford's, she said. Apache warriors and federal soldiers working together to maintain peace rather than perpetuating war. "What exactly are you proposing?" Judge Harrison asked. Elena unfolded the proposal she had spent weeks refining, presenting them with the confidence of someone who had considered every possible objection. First, formal recognition of sacred sites that would be protected from mining claims and settlement. Second, guaranteed safe passage for Apache traders through territorial towns, with legal protection from harassment or arbitrary arrest. Third, joint patrols of disputed areas, with Apache guides working alongside cavalry troops to prevent misunderstandings like the one that nearly killed Lieutenant Crawford. The silence that followed her presentation carried the weight of possibilities, being weighed against prejudices. These were radical propositions that would require both sides to abandon fundamental assumptions about their relationship. Thunderhawk spoke for the first time since the formal introductions, his voice carrying the skepticism of someone who had seen too many promises broken. "Pretty words," he said. "But what happens when the first white miner ignores sacred site? Boundaries? What happens when the first territorial sheriff decides Apache traders are threats to be eliminated rather than citizens to be protected? Then we have legal remedies instead of military ones," Elena replied without hesitation. We have courts and judges instead of raids and reprisals. Courts that have never ruled in favor of Apache interests, Thunderhawk countered. Judge Harrison stirred uncomfortably. That's not entirely accurate. There have been several cases in 50 years of territorial law, Thunderhawk interrupted. Would you stake your people's survival on those odds? The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Thunderhawk was forcing the federal officials to confront the reality that their legal system had consistently failed to protect Apache interests, making military resistance seem like the only viable option for tribal survival. Colonel Garrett addressed Running Bear directly. Chief, what guarantees can you provide that Apache warriors won't use these proposed agreements as cover for raiding activities? Running Bear's response carried the weight of someone speaking for generations of his people. The same guarantees your government has provided that white settlers won't use territorial law as cover for stealing Apache land. We offer trust in exchange for trust, honor in exchange for honor. The negotiations continued throughout the morning, with each side probing for weaknesses in the other's positions, while searching for common ground on which genuine agreement might be built. Elena served as translator not just of languages but of concepts, helping federal officials understand Apache perspectives while explaining territorial law to her father's delegation. Gradually, the framework of a possible agreement began to emerge. Sacred sites would receive legal protection comparable to military reservations. Apache traders would be issued territorial licenses that would protect them from arbitrary harassment. Joint patrols would operate under carefully defined rules of engagement that emphasized de-escalation over confrontation. But the most crucial element remained unresolved: enforcement. Mechanisms that would ensure both sides honored their commitments when political pressures pushed them toward conflict. Words on paper mean nothing without consequences for breaking them, Thunderhawk insisted. What happens to federal officials who violate these agreements? What happens to Apache leaders who fail to control their warriors? Judge Martinez suggested a joint tribunal system, with both Apache and territorial representatives empowered to investigate violations and impose penalties. It was an innovative approach that would require unprecedented cooperation between legal systems that had historically operated as adversaries. As afternoon shadows began lengthening across the barn floor, Jack realized they were approaching the moment when abstract possibilities would either crystallize into concrete agreements or dissolve into renewed hostilities. There's one more issue we need to address, he said, drawing everyone's attention. Elena's personal situation. The marriage alliance with Thunderhawk that sparked this entire crisis. Running Bear's expression showed the strain of a father, torn between tribal obligations and his daughter's happiness. Elena has chosen her path. She will serve her people as a diplomat rather than as a wife. Thunderhawk's reaction was immediate and intense. And what of the alliance between our bands? What of the warriors my people would have contributed to Chief Running Bear's defense? Perhaps, Elena said quietly, there are alliances more valuable than marriage treaties. She turned to address both delegations with words that would either unite them in common purpose or drive them apart in irreconcilable opposition. Instead of an alliance built on my unwilling marriage, what if we built an alliance based on shared success? Thunderhawk's warriors and my father's people, working together not for war, but for the peace that would protect all Apache interests. The proposal was audacious in its simplicity. Rather than eliminating Thunderhawk from the political equation, Elena was offering him a role in the diplomatic solution that would enhance rather than diminish his influence. Thunderhawk studied her face with the intensity of someone reading a map in unfamiliar territory. You would trust me to honor agreements with people I have been fighting for years? I would trust you to honor agreements that serve your people's interests, Elena replied. And I would trust you to recognize that peace serves those interests better than perpetual war. The moment of decision had arrived. Jack could feel the weight of history pressing down on the barn like a physical force. Generations of conflict, decades of mutual distrust, and years of accumulated grievances all balanced on the choices these few people would make in the next few minutes. Chief Running Bear stood slowly, his movement drawing everyone's attention like a lodestone, attracting iron filings. "My daughter has wisdom beyond her years," he announced. "She sees possibilities where others see only problems. I accept her proposal for diplomatic alliance instead of military marriage." Thunderhawk remained seated for a long moment, his internal struggle visible in the tension around his eyes. When he finally rose, his words carried the weight of someone abandoning familiar ground for uncharted territory. "I will try this path of peace," he said. "But if it fails, if the white man betrays these agreements as they have betrayed so many others, the Apache Nation will remember that Thunderhawk warned against trusting their promises." Judge Harrison cleared his throat nervously. "These proposals will require ratification by the territorial legislature. We can't guarantee." "Then we reconvene in 30 days. Jack interrupted, recognizing that the moment of consensus was fragile and needed to be protected from bureaucratic complications. 30 days for both sides to sell these agreements to their people. 30 days to prove that cooperation serves everyone's interests better than conflict. Colonel Garrett nodded slowly. "The Army can support a 30-day suspension of hostilities while these proposals are evaluated." As the delegations prepared to depart, Elena approached her father with the careful respect of someone seeking reconciliation after defying tribal authority. "Father," she said in Apache, "have I dishonored our family?" Running Bear's response carried the love of a parent who had watched his child grow into someone stronger and wiser than he had dared hope. "Daughter, you have honored our family and our people. Your courage in choosing a difficult path has opened possibilities that my generation could not imagine." Thunderhawk paused as he prepared to mount his horse, turning back to Jack with an expression that might have been respect or might have been warning. "White man," he said, "you have involved yourself in Apache affairs more deeply than any outsider. In memory, that involvement cannot be undone, regardless of whether these agreements succeed or fail." "I understand," Jack replied. "Do you? If we succeed, you will be remembered as the man who helped forge peace between our peoples. If we fail, you will be remembered as the man whose promises led my people into a trap." "Unwilling to accept that responsibility," Jack said. Thunderhawk nodded once, then swung onto his horse and rode away with the Apache delegation, leaving dust and the weight of enormous expectations in their wake. As the federal officials prepared for their journey back to Copper Ridge, Captain Hayes pulled Jack aside for a private conversation. "You realize what you've committed to here," Hayes sighed. "If this diplomatic experiment fails, if Apache warriors start raiding settlements while claiming these agreements as justification, every death will be laid at your doorstep." "And if it succeeds?" Jack asked. "If it succeeds, you'll have accomplished something no military officer or territorial official has managed in 50 years of trying." Hayes paused, studying Jack's face with the assessment of someone evaluating a former subordinate's judgment. "Either way, your quiet ranching days are over." That evening, as the sun set over the Sangre de Cristo Valley, Jack and Elena sat on the porch where everything had begun just days earlier. The ranch looked the same: corrals and outbuildings, cattle grazing in distant pastures, Sam Torres tending to evening chores, but everything had changed in ways that couldn't be measured by physical appearances. "Do you think it will work?" Elena asked. Jack considered the question with the honesty it deserved. "I think we've given it the best chance possible. Whether that's enough depends on people whose names we don't know making choices we can't control." "My father believes it will work," Elena said. "He sees something in you that reminds him of the cavalry officers who honored their word, even when their government did not." "And Thunderhawk?" Thunderhawk will keep his word because his honor demands it, but he will also prepare for war because his experience demands it. Elena smiled slightly. Perhaps that balance between hope and caution is exactly what we need. The sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the road, but these riders moved with the easy pace of people bringing good news rather than the urgent intensity of crisis. Sam Torres rode toward the house with a wide grin on his weathered face, followed by Maria Santos and 3 other ranchers from the surrounding area. "Senator Jack," Sam called out as he dismounted, "the whole valley is talking about what happened here today. People are saying you might have prevented a war that would have burned out every ranch from here to Mexico." Maria approached the porch with the practical concern of someone who had spent her life treating the wounds that conflict created. "Is it true?" she asked Elena. "Will there be peace between your people and ours?" "We have begun the conversation that could lead to peace," Elena replied carefully. "Whether we complete that conversation successfully depends on how badly both sides want to live without fear." The neighboring ranchers spent the evening sharing stories and speculation about the implications of the day's agreements. They spoke of Apache traders bringing goods to territorial markets, of joint patrols preventing the kind of misunderstandings that had nearly cost Lieutenant Crawford his life, of children growing up in a valley where different peoples could coexist without constant vigilance against attack. As the visitors departed and quiet settled over the ranch, Jack found himself standing by the window, where he had spent so many evenings watching for threats that never materialized. Tonight, the horizon held different possibilities, the chance that watching for enemies might become unnecessary, that the careful isolation he had built might give way to genuine community. Elena joined him at the window, her presence beside him feeling as natural as sunrise after a long, cold night. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we wait," Jack replied. "We wait to see if politicians and warriors can keep the promises their representatives made today. We wait to see if the people of this valley can learn to trust each other instead of fear each other. And us? What happens to us?" Jack turned to look at her, seeing in her face the reflection of his own uncertainty about their future. The crisis that had brought them together was resolving, but that resolution opened new questions about what came next. "I don't know," he admitted. "I know I don't want to go back to the way things were before you arrived. I know I don't want to face whatever comes next without you beside me." Elena smiled, the expression transforming her face with warmth that had nothing to do with political alliances or diplomatic agreements. "Then perhaps we don't have to know everything," she said. "Perhaps it's enough to know that we want to find out together." 3 months later, the territorial legislature ratified the agreements negotiated in Jack Morrison's barn by a margin of 2 votes. Apache traders began appearing in territorial markets, their exotic goods creating economic opportunities that benefited both communities. Joint patrols reported a dramatic reduction in violent incidents along the boundary between Apache and settled lands. Lieutenant Crawford returned to duty with a commendation for valor and a unique perspective on Apache culture that made him invaluable for future diplomatic missions. Thunderhawk established himself as a peace chief whose influence grew as the success of diplomatic solutions proved their worth. And in the Sangre de Cristo Valley, a former cavalry officer and an Apache chief's daughter built a life together that served as living proof that honor and love could transcend the boundaries that politics and prejudice had tried to make permanent. The loner rancher had saved more than chief running bear's daughter. He had saved his own soul by rediscovering what it meant to fight for something greater than himself. And when 200 Apache warriors had come for his soul, they had found instead a man who had already given it freely to a cause worth any sacrifice. 2 years had passed since the historic meeting in Jack Morrison's barn, and the Sangre de Cristo Valley had transformed in ways that would have seemed impossible during the days when armed patrols were necessary to venture beyond one's own property line. The transformation wasn't merely political or economic, it was spiritual, a fundamental shift in how people saw themselves and their neighbors. Jack stood in the doorway of the new trading post that had been constructed where his old tool shed once stood, watching Elena negotiate with a Mexican merchant whose wagons carried goods from as far south as Guadalajara. Her Spanish flowed as naturally as her English and Apache, creating bridges between worlds that had previously existed in isolation from each other. The merchant's respectful attention spoke to the reputation Elena had earned not just as chief, Running Bear's daughter, but as someone whose word carried weight in commercial transactions spanning 3 cultures. The trading post represented more than economic opportunity, it symbolized the practical reality of peace. Apache artisans brought intricate beadwork and pottery that commanded premium prices in territorial markets. Mexican traders offered manufactured goods and exotic spices that had been unavailable in frontier communities. White settlers contributed agricultural products and livestock that fed the growing network of peaceful exchange. Sam Torres approached from the corral where he'd been working with a young Apache man named Joseph Crowfeather, teaching him the finer points of horse training techniques that combined Mexican vaquero traditions with Apache horsemanship. The collaboration had produced results that surprised everyone. Horses trained through this hybrid method showed remarkable intelligence and loyalty, making them highly sought after by ranchers throughout the territory. "Center Jack," Sam said, wiping sweat from his forehead with a bandana that bore Apache geometric designs, a gift from Joseph's grandmother. "The spring roundup numbers are better than we projected. The herd has grown by 40% since last year." The success wasn't accidental. Apache knowledge of seasonal grazing patterns, combined with Mexican cattle management techniques and Jack's military organization skills, had created a ranching operation that worked with the land's natural rhythms rather than fighting against them. Other ranchers were beginning to adopt similar approaches, leading to improved productivity throughout the valley. Elena finished her negotiations with the Mexican merchant and joined Jack and Sam, her face showing the satisfaction of someone who had just concluded a mutually beneficial agreement. "Senator Martinez will take 50 pieces of Maria Lightfoot's pottery to trade in Santa Fe," she reported. "He's offering twice what the local markets pay, and he's guaranteed to return with silver jewelry that our Apache artisans can't produce themselves." The economic prosperity was remarkable, but Jack found himself more impressed by the social changes that accompanied it. Apache families were establishing seasonal camps near territorial settlements, creating opportunities for their children to learn English and mathematics while maintaining their traditional languages and customs. White families were learning Apache techniques for water conservation and sustainable hunting practices that had sustained indigenous communities for centuries. The most visible symbol of these changes was the school that had been built in Copper Ridge with funding from both territorial taxes and Apache tribal contributions. Maria Santos served as head teacher, instructing children whose parents would have been shooting at each other just 2 years earlier. Elena taught Apache language and culture twice a week, while retired cavalry officers provided instruction in mathematics and geography. Captain Hayes had become one of the school's strongest supporters, often remarking that education represented a more effective long-term strategy for territorial development than military occupation. His transformation from skeptical military officer to advocate for cultural integration reflected changes that were occurring throughout the territorial administration. "Any word from Thunderhawk?" Jack asked Elena as they walked toward the main house. "He's established a permanent camp near the Mexican border," Elena replied. "His warriors are working with territorial rangers to prevent smuggling operations that had been using Apache territory to avoid federal patrols." Thunderhawk's evolution had been one of the most surprising aspects of the peace process. The war chief who had once threatened to take Elena by force had become one of the most effective enforcers of the new agreements. His reputation for violence now served diplomatic rather than military purposes. Potential treaty violators knew that Thunderhawk's justice was swift and impartial. He's also begun courting the daughter of a Mexican rancher near El Paso. Elena added with a slight smile. Apparently, peace has given him time to discover interests beyond warfare. The irony wasn't lost on Jack. The arranged marriage Elena had fled to avoid had been replaced by a voluntary romance that served everyone's interests better than the original political alliance. Thunderhawk's growing influence among Mexican settlers was creating new opportunities for trade and cooperation that extended far beyond the original Apache territorial agreements. As they reached the porch, Jack noticed a rider approaching from the direction of Copper Ridge. The horseman's unhurried pace suggested routine business rather than emergency, but Jack had learned to pay attention to all visitors during these times of delicate peace. The rider proved to be Deputy Frank Miller, whose youthful enthusiasm had made him a valuable liaison between territorial law enforcement and Apache tribal authorities. Miller dismounted with the easy confidence of someone who no longer expected hostile reception at the Morrison ranch. "Afternoon, Mr. Morrison, Miss Elena," Miller said, touching his hat brim respectfully. "Got some news from the territorial capital that you'll want to hear." "Good news or bad news?" Elena asked. "Depends on your perspective," Miller replied, pulling a folded document from his saddlebag. "Governor's office has approved the establishment of a formal Apache territorial reservation, with Chief Running Bear as the appointed administrator." The implications were staggering. Rather than being confined to a traditional reservation under federal supervision, the Apache would receive official recognition as territorial partners, with administrative authority over their traditional lands. It represented a level of political autonomy that no indigenous group had achieved in the American West. "What are the boundaries?" Jack asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Everything north of the Sangre de Cristo Valley to the Colorado border," Miller replied. "About 2 million acres, including all the sacred sites and traditional hunting grounds." Elena's sharp intake of breath reflected her understanding of what this meant for her people. Instead of being gradually pushed onto smaller and smaller parcels of marginal land, the Apache would receive legal protection for an area large enough to sustain their traditional way of life while participating in the territorial economy. "There's more," Miller continued. "The territorial legislature has voted to fund a railroad spur that would connect Copper Ridge to the main transcontinental line. The economic development potential is enormous, but the route would need to cross Apache territorial lands." "And?" Elena prompted. "And the railroad company is required to negotiate directly with Chief Running Bear for right-of-way agreements. No federal intervention, no military pressure. Pure commercial negotiation between equal parties." Jack understood the revolutionary nature of what Miller was describing. The railroad would bring unprecedented economic opportunities to the entire region, but only if the Apache chose to participate as partners, rather than being forced to accept whatever terms the government imposed. "When does the negotiation begin?" Elena asked. "Next month. Governor specifically requested that you serve as the Apache representative, given your success with the original territorial agreements." Elena looked toward the mountains where her father's village lay hidden among the ancient rocks and sacred places. The young woman who had fled an arranged marriage 2 years earlier was being invited to negotiate one of the most important commercial agreements in territorial history. "I'll need to consult with my father and the tribal council," she said finally. "Of course," Miller replied. "But Miss Elena, I hope you understand how much this opportunity means for everyone in the territory. The railroad could bring prosperity to every community from here to the Mexican border." After Miller departed, Jack and Elena sat on the porch, where their relationship had begun, watching the sun descend toward the western mountains. The familiar ritual carried different meaning now, instead of a lonely man's solitary evening routine. It had become a shared contemplation of the day's accomplishments and tomorrow's possibilities. "Are you ready for this?" Jack asked. "I don't know," Elena replied honestly. Negotiating grazing rights and trading agreements is one thing. Negotiating the future economic development of the entire territory is something else entirely. You'll have advisors. Your father, Thunderhawk, even some of the territorial officials who've learned to respect Apache perspectives. "I'll have advisors," Elena agreed. "But the final decisions will be mine to make. The responsibility for success or failure will rest on my shoulders alone." Jack reached for her hand, feeling the calluses that had developed from 2 years of ranch work combined with diplomatic travel. Elena had chosen to build her life at the intersection of multiple worlds, and that choice required constant adaptation to new challenges and opportunities. "You won't be alone," Jack said quietly. "Whatever decisions you make, whatever consequences follow, we'll face them together." Elena smiled, the expression carrying warmth that had nothing to do with political calculations or economic opportunities. "Together, I like the sound of that." The evening brought visitors who had become regular guests at the Morrison ranch. Chief Running Bear arrived with 2 tribal elders, their presence indicating that Apache leadership was taking the railroad negotiations seriously. Maria Santos came with her usual basket of herbs and medical supplies, but also with detailed notes about the educational opportunities that railroad access could bring to territorial schools. The discussion that followed dinner reflected the complexity of decisions that would affect generations of people throughout the region. The railroad promised unprecedented prosperity, but it also threatened to accelerate changes that could overwhelm traditional ways of life faster than communities could adapt. "The Iron Horse brings both opportunity and danger," Chief Running Bear observed in his measured English. "Our people have survived by adapting to change, but this change moves faster than any we have faced before. The question isn't whether to accept change," Elena replied. "The question is whether we guide that change or let it guide us." The conversation continued late into the evening, with each participant contributing perspectives shaped by their unique cultural backgrounds and personal experiences. Gradually, the framework of an approach began to emerge, one that would embrace the economic opportunities of railroad development while establishing safeguards to protect the cultural and environmental values that made the territory worth preserving. Over the following weeks, Elena traveled throughout Apache territory, consulting with tribal councils and individual families about their hopes and concerns regarding the proposed railroad development. She also met with territorial officials, railroad executives, and leaders of settler communities to understand their expectations and requirements. The negotiations that began the following month took place in the same barn where the original peace agreements had been forged, but the atmosphere was markedly different. Instead of suspicious adversaries reluctantly seeking alternatives to war, the participants approached the table as experienced partners working to solve complex problems through collaboration. Elena's opening presentation reflected the sophistication she had developed through 2 years of diplomatic experience. Rather than simply reacting to railroad company proposals, she presented a comprehensive Apache vision for regional development that addressed economic, environmental, and cultural considerations in an integrated framework. "The railroad will bring change to our territory whether we participate or not," she told the assembled representatives. "By participating as full partners, we can ensure that change serves everyone's interests rather than just the interests of distant investors." The Apache proposals were ambitious in scope and innovative in approach. Rather than simply granting right-of-way access, the tribal government offered to become a major investor in railroad construction, contributing both financial resources and labor in exchange for permanent ownership stakes in the railroad company itself. "You're proposing that Apache territory become a railroad partner rather than just a railroad customer?" asked James Harrison, the lead railroad executive. "We're proposing that Apache people become railroad owners rather than just railroad employees," Elena corrected. "We're offering to contribute $2 million in silver and gold from tribal resources, plus 500 skilled workers for construction projects, in exchange for 20% ownership of the Southwestern Division." The proposal stunned the railroad representatives, who had expected to negotiate modest compensation for land use rights, rather than discuss major partnership arrangements. But Elena's financial projections were compelling. Apache investment would reduce construction costs, while providing access to mineral resources and skilled labor that could accelerate project completion by months or even years. The negotiations continued for 6 weeks, with Elena demonstrating the same diplomatic skills that had prevented war 2 years earlier. But now those skills were focused on creating prosperity rather than avoiding destruction, on building economic bridges rather than preventing military conflicts. The final agreement exceeded everyone's expectations. The Apache territorial government became a 25% partner in the Southwestern Railroad Company, with guaranteed representation on the corporate board and shared authority over route planning and construction practices. In exchange, Apache territory would provide financial investment, mineral resources, construction labor, and ongoing security for railroad operations. The celebration that followed the signing ceremony reflected the profound transformation that had occurred in the Sangre de Cristo Valley. Apache drummers and Mexican guitarists performed together while territorial officials and tribal elders shared food and stories around fires that had been lit to commemorate the occasion. Jack found himself standing apart from the festivities, watching Elena move between different groups of celebrants with the grace of someone who belonged equally in all worlds. The young woman who had arrived at his ranch as a wounded refugee had become one of the most influential political and economic leaders in the American Southwest. "She has become something remarkable," Chief Running Bear said, joining Jack at his observation post. "She was already remarkable," Jack replied. "She just needed the opportunity to show it." "And you provided that opportunity," Running Bear observed. "By choosing to help rather than ignore, by choosing to risk rather than remain safe." Jack turned to study the Apache leader's weathered face. "I made the only choice I could live with." "That is what honor means," Running Bear said simply. "Making the choice you can live with, regardless of the consequences." As the celebration continued into the night, Jack and Elena found themselves walking toward Willow Creek, where cottonwood trees created a natural amphitheater illuminated by moonlight reflected off the flowing water. The sounds of music and laughter drifted from the ranch house, but here they could talk privately about the future that stretched before them. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't found me in that mine shaft?" Elena asked. Jack considered the question seriously. "I think someone else would have found you eventually. I think you would have found a way to accomplish what you've accomplished, because that's who you are. And what about you? Do you think you would have found your way out of isolation without someone forcing you to choose between safety and honor?" "I don't know," Jack admitted. "I might have spent the rest of my life waiting for something that never came, watching sunsets alone and wondering why nothing ever changed." Elena stopped walking and turned to face him directly. "Do you miss it sometimes? The simplicity of solitude, the predictability of isolation?" "No," Jack replied without hesitation. "I miss the illusion that isolation meant safety, but I don't miss the reality that isolation meant emptiness." They stood beside the creek where Apache families now camped seasonally, where children played games that combined traditions from multiple cultures, where the sound of different languages created a symphony of human diversity rather than a cacophony of conflict. "What happens next?" Elena asked, echoing the question she had posed 2 years earlier. "Next, we watch the railroad transform the territory in ways we can't predict," Jack replied. Next, we help our communities adapt to changes that will come faster than anyone expects. Next, we discover whether the peace we've built is strong enough to survive the prosperity it has created. And personally? What happens to us personally? Jack smiled, remembering his former self who had been afraid to hope for anything beyond mere survival. Personally, I think we continue building something worth defending. I think we prove that love can be stronger than fear, that cooperation can be more profitable than conflict, that the future can be better than the past. Elena reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. I love the certainty in your voice when you talk about our future. I love the way you make that future seem not just possible, but inevitable, Jack replied. 5 years later, the Sangre de Cristo Valley had become one of the most prosperous regions in the American Southwest. The railroad brought tourists who came to experience the unique blend of cultures that had made peaceful coexistence not just possible but profitable. Apache guides led expeditions to sacred sites that had been opened for respectful visitation. Mexican artisans established workshops that combined traditional techniques with modern materials. White settlers developed agricultural innovations that increased productivity while preserving environmental resources. Elena Morrison, she had taken Jack's name in a ceremony that honored both Apache and territorial traditions, served as the territory's first female delegate to Congress, where her advocacy for indigenous rights and economic development had earned respect from legislators who had initially dismissed her as a curiosity. Jack Morrison had been elected to the Territorial Council, where his military experience and diplomatic skills made him invaluable for resolving conflicts that might otherwise have escalated into violence. The ranch that had once been his refuge from the world had become a center for regional government and economic planning. But on quiet evenings, when the day's responsibilities were complete and the visitors had departed, Jack and Elena still sat on the porch where everything had begun. They watched sunsets paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson while their children, 2 sons and a daughter who carried the heritage of both their peoples, played in the yard where Apache warriors and federal soldiers had once faced each other with weapons drawn. Do you think we accomplished what we set out to accomplish? Elena asked one such evening. We accomplished more than we set out to accomplish, Jack replied. We set out to prevent a war. We ended up building a civilization where our children can grow up without learning to hate people who look different from them. Elena observed. A civilization where our grandchildren might not even understand what we mean when we talk about the old days of suspicion and violence, Jack added. As if summoned by their conversation, their youngest child, 3-year-old Sarah Running Bear Morrison, toddled onto the porch carrying a wooden horse that had been carved by Thunderhawk during his last visit. The little girl settled between her parents with the unconscious confidence of someone who had never known a world where love was limited by racial boundaries or political affiliations. Tell story, Sarah demanded, using the mixture of Apache and English that served as her primary language. Elena lifted her daughter onto her lap, smoothing the dark hair that reminded Jack so poignantly of the young woman who had appeared in his life like a desert storm, sudden, transformative, and impossible to ignore. Once upon a time, Elena began, there was a lonely man who lived on a ranch in a beautiful valley where people were afraid of each other instead of loving each other. Why afraid? Sarah asked. Because they had forgotten that fear makes people smaller while love makes them bigger, Elena explained. What happened to the lonely man? Sarah prompted, though she had heard this story countless times. He learned that the best way to stop being lonely was to help someone else stop being afraid, Elena continued. And when he chose love instead of fear, everything in the valley began to change. Did they live happily ever after? Sarah asked, using the traditional ending she had learned from the stories Maria Santos told at the Territorial School. Elena and Jack exchanged a look that carried the weight of everything they had experienced together, the dangers they had faced, the obstacles they had overcome, the future they were building for their children and grandchildren. They lived purposefully ever after, Elena said finally. Which turned out to be even better than happiness, because purpose creates happiness, while happiness doesn't always create purpose. As the stars emerged in the darkening sky above the Sangre de Cristo Valley, 3 generations of the Morrison family settled into the peaceful evening routine that had replaced Jack's solitary vigil of years past. The ranch that had once been a refuge from the world had become a foundation for a better world, proving that sometimes the most important journeys begin with a simple choice to help someone who needs assistance. The loner rancher had indeed saved Chief Running Bear's daughter, but more importantly, he had saved himself by discovering that true strength came not from isolation, but from connection, not from independence, but from interdependence, not from building walls, but from building bridges that could span any divide that politics or prejudice might create. And in the end, when 200 Apache warriors had come for his soul, they had found instead a man who had already given it freely to something greater than himself, to love that transcended boundaries, to hope that survived disappointments, and to the belief that human beings were capable of choosing cooperation over conflict when they were brave enough to trust each other with their dreams. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.